Imagine sitting in a quiet, fancy room with your whole family, not knowing why you were all called there. That is exactly what happened to Prince William, Princess Catherine, Queen Camilla, and Princess Anne. The air was so thick with tension you could have cut it with a knife. King Charles III had summoned them to a super-secret meeting, and nobody knew why. Then he opened a red folder, and the words he spoke changed their lives forever. He announced the date of his own goodbye to the crown. For the first time ever, the whole world would get to watch the ceremony from home. But what the cameras didn't catch, what happened behind those closed doors, is the real story. It is a story of secrets, a private fight, and a mother's love that refused to be silenced. The sealed folder sat on the grand wooden table between them. King Charles did not grab it right away. He looked first at his son William, then at Catherine, at Camilla, and at his sister Princess Anne. In that heavy silence, before a single word was spoken, every single person in that private room understood that what was about to happen could not be taken back. This was not a regular meeting to plan a garden party. No one had seen a schedule. No press secretary had been told anything. The call had come out of the blue, and that mystery was its own kind of warning. When a king calls his family to a secret room without saying why, the news inside that room is never small. Charles opened the folder, and right then the British monarchy changed forever. What you're about to hear is the whole story. The private argument no camera caught. The sealed letter William was too scared to open. The moment Catherine stood up to Camilla with no one else in the room to back her up, and the single handwritten sentence that explained the huge secret Charles had been keeping for months. Stick with this story until the very end, because the final detail, the thing Catherine added to the coronation plan, is the part no one has really talked about, and it might just be the most important thing this family has done in a very long time. Let's go back to the beginning, not the public start but the real one. Charles had called 5 people to Buckingham Palace's private meeting room. William, Catherine, Camilla, Princess Anne, and a few very important advisors. No one was told why they were coming. The worry in that room was not an accident. The king did it on purpose. This special room is not used for everyday chats. It is saved for choices that are too sensitive, too big, and too permanent for public gossip. Everyone who walked in knew that, which is why the silence before Charles spoke felt so heavy. When the king finally opened the red folder, he did not give a gentle introduction. He did not try to make anyone feel better. He simply said the date. Saturday, November 14, 2026 at Westminster Abbey. William's coronation. Think about what that means for a moment, not as a headline in a newspaper, but as a real human moment. The man sitting across that table had waited his whole life, through sadness, through scandals, through public anger, through so many years of waiting to wear the crown, and now he was announcing the day he would hand it over. William did not grab the papers. He just stared at his dad and asked one simple question. Why now? Charles looked down at the table instead of answering. That one moment where a king refused to meet his son's eyes said more than any official statement ever could. The date had not been picked by chance. It had not been picked because it was easy. It had been picked because something had happened, something Charles was not yet ready to talk about in front of everyone. Catherine felt the fear coming from William before he even knew it himself. Becoming queen was not just a new title for her. It would change everything. Her daily life, her privacy, the childhood of her 3 children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. They were not ready for what that crown would ask of them. And a mother sitting in that room understood that truth better than any palace worker ever could. But then came the second shock. Charles announced that the whole feeling and look of the coronation, the music, where the family would sit, the royal honors, the whole ceremony would be put under Catherine's direct control. Not William's, not Camilla's. Catherine's. You could feel the room change. Everyone knew what that choice meant, and not everyone was happy about it. Camilla's face turned to stone. The queen consort leaned forward. She had survived years of public hate just to sit next to that king. She had been through more than most people could ever imagine. She had a voice in this family, and she planned to use it. But before she could say a word, Charles closed the folder. He just closed it. Camilla's protest died in her throat, and Princess Anne, who has spent decades reading royal rooms and knowing exactly what is going on, understood right away that this wound was not going to heal quietly. It would grow, and it would eventually force a fight that no closed folder could stop. William finally put one hand on the red cover, but he did not open it. Catherine rested her fingers on his wrist. No words, just that small touch. And Charles watched them with a look that mixed pride with something sadder, something that looked a lot like grief. Then he noticed something no one else had caught. Under Charles's chair, mostly hidden and placed there on purpose, was a second sealed envelope. William's initials were on the front, with 4 words beneath them: to be opened privately. The date had been shared, but the bigger shock was still locked inside that paper, and Charles had not dared to open it in front of the family. Now, think about this. What could a king write to his son that was so private he could not share it in a room full of his most trusted family members, that he chose to hide it under his chair instead of putting it on the table? That question is what drove everything that followed. William left the meeting without opening the envelope. He had spent years learning about royal rules and reading important papers. He had practiced for this moment and learned all the steps a future king needs to know. But that practice had always been at a safe distance. The crown was coming, not yet, later, someday, but the confirmed date of November 14th ended that comfort forever. Being king was no longer a faraway job. It was a fixed stop on the road, and William was already walking toward it, whether he felt ready or not. Catherine followed him into a private hallway. She waited until the door shut. Then she spoke, not as a future queen, but as his wife, as the mother of his children, as the one person in that palace who was allowed to tell him the truth without any fancy talk. She told him that George, Charlotte, and Louis would feel his fear before any palace worker did. Kids read their parents with a sharpness that no adult can match. If William let panic take over, if the worry seen in that meeting followed him home, his children would start being scared of the crown before they were even old enough to understand what it meant. William held the sealed envelope tightly. Catherine's words helped him, but they did not take away the weight. Meanwhile, in his private study, Charles took off his glasses and sat alone with a framed picture of his sons. Pride and regret both at the same time. That is what passing on a crown does to a father who is also a king. He had spent years getting William ready to rule, yet the crown had slowly come between them, into every talk, every shared moment, every plan for the future. Father and son could no longer talk about tomorrow without feeling the change happening between them in real time. Camilla walked into the study without knocking. She asked Charles if he had already started removing her from the future. That is a heartbreaking question. It is important to understand it fully. This was not jealousy. This was not just ambition. This was a woman who had stood by a king through everything the royal family had thrown at them. Now she was watching the plan for the next reign being built, and she found out her name was not on the blueprints. Charles put down his pen slowly. He understood her pain. He did not ignore it. He knew how much she had carried with him, but he refused to change his choice. And before Camilla could answer, Princess Anne found William in another hallway and told him something that changed everything. The date had not been picked because it was convenient. It was tied to a secret promise made after a family crisis. A crisis that had happened inside Windsor Castle, one Charles had never fully talked about. William broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was one handwritten sentence. This date became inevitable after what happened at Windsor. What really happened at Windsor? This is where the story goes deeper than any public announcement could reach. Months before the coronation date was set, Charles had planned a private practice ceremony at Windsor Castle. The stated reason was simple and smart: to see how the senior family would react if the king suddenly could not finish a major state duty. A rehearsal, a safety check, nothing more. That is what William believed. Catherine, however, understood something more worrying. The king was not just watching a practice exercise. He was testing discipline, loyalty, and emotional control under pressure. This was an audition for what the monarchy would look like after Charles, and everyone in that room was performing without knowing the real stakes. The exercise presented a made-up crisis: cancelled events, delayed papers, urgent choices. Then a senior palace worker asked the question that broke the whole practice wide open: who would lead if Charles could no longer do his job? Camilla stepped forward before William could say a word. The queen consort declared that no change should happen without her okay. The room froze. Charles stared at her, not with anger but with disbelief. He had expected worry. He was ready for some resistance, but he was not ready for someone to claim power over the succession itself. William stayed quiet out of respect for his father's wife, out of loyalty to his dad, and because he knew this was not the time to fight. But Catherine saw the danger in that silence right away. William's politeness was being seen as uncertainty, and uncertainty at the moment of a big change is a huge problem. It is an invitation for the exact kind of rivalry that breaks things apart. After the practice, Charles talked to William in a side room. The question was direct. Why had he not spoken up? William's answer was also direct. He would not fight Camilla for power while his father was still king. The words showed loyalty. They also showed the weak spot that happens when a big change is left unclear. Catherine walked in moments later and said what needed to be said. She told Charles that William's quietness was not weakness, it was respect. But she warned him clearly, without softening the message, that waiting too long would let other people build power around William before he had the tools to protect his own place. Charles took off his signet ring, the personal seal of royal power, and placed it on the table between himself and his son. One day, silence will no longer protect you. That same night, the king told his private secretary to get a fixed coronation schedule ready. And in the same planning memo, he put Catherine in charge of the planning group. The Windsor rehearsal had shown the crack in the family, and Charles had responded by doing the one thing no one expected him to do so soon. He started building William's future before anyone could mess with it. But Camilla was not finished. When she learned that what happened at Windsor had directly led to the coronation date, she asked for a private meeting with Catherine. And this fight is the moment that most royal news has missed. There were no advisors, no secretaries, no husbands, no palace workers. Just two women connected to the same crown, split by what its future should mean. The meeting took place at Clarence's house, Camilla's home, a very personal choice of location. She had expected papers, maybe a lawyer, certainly some kind of palace buffer standing between her and the future queen. Instead, Catherine arrived alone and with empty hands. The message was clear. Catherine was going to speak as a future queen, not hide behind rules. Camilla started with an accusation. The new coronation plans, she argued, were letting Charles erase his own reign before it had even ended. Every old tradition that was removed made the crown he still wore look weaker. The history of the family demanded respect, and what Catherine was building did not have enough of it. Catherine did not back down. She answered that getting William ready was not an attack on the king. It was protection against the chaos that Windsor had already shown to the whole room. The argument got sharper from there. Camilla told Catherine she could never fully understand what surviving inside the royal family truly cost. She talked about years of hate, public judgment, being alone, the endless weight of a family that had treated her as a problem before it accepted her as a queen. She insisted that her endurance had earned her a voice in the future. Catherine listened. Then she gave the answer that changed the whole feeling of the room. Survival, she said, could not become the institution's main purpose. Camilla then made two clear demands: prominent seating for her family, a formal ceremonial role during the coronation service. Catherine said no to both. She explained calmly, without meanness, that the coronation would focus on constitutional history, the lawful passing of royal duty from Charles to William. It was not meant to give out private rewards or show personal favorites. And then she showed Camilla something she had not expected: the signed planning instruction that Charles had written after the Windsor fight, in which he had personally ordered the removal of a disputed part of the ceremony. The king had made the choice himself. This was not Catherine's ambition being forced on the event. This was the king's own order in writing with his name on it. Camilla could no longer call this a power grab by a pushy princess. Camilla pushed her chair back and asked if Catherine planned to become queen before the crown had even touched her head. Catherine stood up, paused at the door, and answered with 7 words, "No, I intend to be ready when it does." Within hours, Camilla went straight to Charles and asked him to undo the choice. The private fight was over, but the king would now have to choose between protecting his wife from embarrassment and protecting his son's big change from interference. He could not do both. Here is the question that every person watching this story needs to think about for a second. When a king has spent his whole life waiting for the crown, when the family he leads has shaped every relationship, every loss, every public and private choice he has ever made, what does it cost him to sign away his own power before anyone has forced him to? Because Charles was not pushed. He was not forced by sickness to speed up the timeline. He was not facing a crisis that demanded quick action. He made a choice. A voluntary, careful, painful choice, and understanding why he made it explains everything that followed. Camilla met Charles moments after leaving Catherine and demanded that he change the power structure before the plans became public. She argued that letting Catherine run the coronation would make his own reign look weak before it had even ended. She told him that Catherine's growing power made her feel like a guest in the reign she had helped him survive. Charles understood her fear. He really did. He did not make light of the years she had stood by him. But he also knew that the crown could not be run just to make people feel better. The future could not be put off just to make the present feel safer. Princess Anne joined Charles afterward and found him sitting next to an unsigned order. She told him plainly what waiting would cost. Every unclear order would create rival groups around William. Without firm limits, advisors, relatives, and private households would all start fighting to be close to the future king. The plan existed to stop exactly that kind of chaos, and leaving it vague would guarantee it. Charles signed the document. It confirmed that Catherine's ceremonial choices could only be overruled by William or the king himself, not by Camilla, not by courtiers, not by distant relatives or outside advisors. Camilla read the first paragraph, closed the folder, and took her hand off his without a word. Charles did not stop her. The silence between them held the full cost of that choice. And then, almost right away, everything started to move. Papers were sent to different people. Meetings once led by Charles began to have William's name on them. Workers who had served one king for decades were quietly told to get ready for another. Power had started moving before the coronation had even been publicly announced. For Charles, every job he passed on felt like a piece of himself being taken away. For William, every new job arrived with the weight of his father's upcoming absence. The prince received the plan and understood why it mattered, but he watched palace workers start treating his dad like a man already gone, and he corrected them every time it happened. Charles remained the king until the final moment. William insisted on that. No new title, no moved chair, no rerouted paper would be allowed to pretend otherwise. But there was one moment that stopped everything. Charles arrived at a scheduled meeting and found that his usual chair had been pushed a little to the side, while William's seat stood right in the middle of the table. No one had said anything. No insult had been declared. The chair just sat there as if it had always been that way. William noticed his father's face before anyone had the chance to explain or say sorry, and he acted before a single word was spoken. He moved the chair back next to his own and said something that should be remembered for a long time. "I will not begin by pushing you away. Charles sat down next to his son, and for one small moment the crown did not divide them. They were just father and son. That evening the king asked William to meet him alone at Windsor. No Catherine, no Camilla, no Anne, no workers waiting outside the door. The private room Charles chose was the same one where father and son had spoken after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The choice of place was not random. The memories in that room were shared ones, and Charles wanted William to feel that history when he heard what was coming next. William walked in expecting orders. Charles gave him honesty instead. The king admitted that he had worried about waiting too long. He had seen what uncertainty had caused at Windsor, the broken authority, the competing claims, the dangerous confusion about who had the right to lead. He had watched Camilla step forward to fill a gap that should never have been there, and he had made a choice that night. He would not let hesitation become William's problem. The date, Charles explained, was not random. November 14th was the anniversary of a private promise made years earlier, a talk no palace worker had heard, in which Charles had told his son that when the crown finally came near, William would not be left unprepared. Naming the date was his way of keeping that promise before sickness, trouble, or outside pressure could take the choice away from him. Then William spoke. The future king admitted that becoming king was not what scared him most. What he feared, truly deeply feared, was letting the weight of the crown create distance between himself and Catherine, between himself and his children. Duty had already taken parts of their private life. He could not accept a reign that took whatever was left. Charles understood. He had lived that same struggle his whole life. The king told William that Catherine had been put at the center of the coronation because she respected royal history without being trapped by it. Her job was not just for show. As protective, she would guard the people entering the next reign from being eaten up by the family around them. Then Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handwritten card. On it was the coronation promise he had once been scared to make, the serious vow a king gives to serve the country, follow the law, and carry the weight of the crown. He placed it in William's hand. Do not inherit my fear with my crown. William took the card, then set one condition of his own. He would accept the date. He would walk toward Westminster Abbey. He would take the promise and receive the crown. But he needed one thing from his father. Charles would not walk into that abbey as a defeated king. He would walk in as the man who had protected the succession with dignity, with purpose, and with the full power of a king who had chosen this moment, rather than being forced into it. Charles agreed, and with that the battle was over. At exactly 8:00, Buckingham Palace sent out the news. TV schedules changed in the middle of shows. Newspaper presses started again. Crowds gathered outside royal places without being told to. Britain did not just get a piece of royal news. It faced something it had been quietly expecting and avoiding, the end of one reign and the start of another. Camilla watched the first broadcast alone. She listened as the presenter described Catherine as the planner of the new ceremony, the woman who had shaped a coronation meant to carry royal history into a new time. She reached for the remote and turned the volume down, but she did not leave the room. Her silence showed something bigger than anger. It carried the sadness of someone watching the future take shape without her at its center. Catherine saw the public reaction with the calm she had shown the whole time, but she understood the danger of people celebrating in a way that looked like a win over Charles. Through the official statement, she confirmed that Prince George would take part in the service, making a visible link between 3 generations of kingship, while protecting Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis from ceremony pressure they were not ready for. The statement also shared a private family promise. Before the coronation service began, before Westminster Abbey opened its doors to the world, Charles, William, and George would stand together. 3 kings, one ruling, one arriving, one waiting far in the future, connected by blood and duty, and a promise that no crown could break. Outside Buckingham Palace, one image captured everything the country was feeling. A young boy held a handmade sign above the crowd. "Thank you, King Charles, we are ready, William." The picture spread across TV and dominated the front pages the next morning. One newspaper printed Charles on one side, William and Catherine on the other. Across the center, a single headline, "The crown passes with a father's blessing." And then came the final meeting. Catherine walked into the music room at Buckingham Palace, carrying the completed coronation plan, the formal structure deciding how every moment of the service would happen, who would take part, and what each part would mean. She had built it to honor Charles's reign, establish William's power, protect the children, and despite everything, keep Camilla's dignity within the limits the king had set. Camilla studied the final pages. She had believed from the start that Catherine's power was meant to push her aside, that every choice was an act of replacement dressed up as planning. But the finished plan told a different story. Her place in the ceremony remained. It was limited. It was clearly defined, but it was not erased. She did not offer warmth. She did not say sorry for Windsor or Clarence House or for asking Charles to undo his own signed order. But she agreed to support the ceremony without more trouble. That was enough. William turned to his father and thanked him for setting the date before uncertainty could break the family. He admitted that waiting might have let fear, ambition, and private influence grow around the succession until the damage could not be fixed. Charles answered that getting his son ready would become the most important act of his reign. He had spent decades waiting to inherit the crown. His final victory would be giving it away with order, dignity, and complete purpose. Catherine then shared the ceremony's most personal detail. She had saved the final words before William entered Westminster Abbey for Charles alone. No advisor would speak. No palace worker would stand between them. Before the doors opened and the world met its new king, a father would tell his son that the crown passed with his full okay and his full blessing. Charles signed the completed plan under Catherine's name. William signed next to his father. Camilla signed last, and Princess Anne closed the folder. Prince George walked in after the meeting ended and asked William a question that stopped the room. "Does becoming king mean everything will change?" William knelt next to his son and answered, "Our duty will change, our family will not." On the 14th of November 2026, William will walk toward the crown that has waited for him his whole life. Catherine will walk next to him, and behind them both, not as a beaten king, not as a man pushed aside by time or sickness or family pressure, but as the father who chose this moment and shaped it, King Charles will take his place in Westminster Abbey. The monarchy did not break under the weight of this change. It bent, it argued. It faced itself in private rooms with no cameras and no official records. And then it chose unity over fighting, preparation over delay, and a father's love over the last hold on power. That is what the sealed envelope held. That is what the Windsor practice showed. That is what Catherine stood alone in Clarence House to defend. And that is why the date on that red folder, announced in a room full of silence, received by a nation full of feeling, matters far beyond the ceremony it names. The story of this family is far from over, and the next chapter begins on the 14th of November.